Getting the right exposure is not as hard as it seems, as long as you tell the camera which part of the scene you want exposed. Modern day metering gets it right about 90% of the time, but here are some modes that will help you get it right every time. You'll find that most cameras have 3 to 4 different metering modes: evaluative or multi-metering, partial metering, spot metering, and center-weighted metering. We'll focus on the 3 main modes. Matrix metering. The camera takes into account the whole scene in front of it and then adjusts the exposure accordingly so everything is exposed on average. This mode is useful for general scenes but cannot expose properly in tricky lighting situations. Spot metering. This metering method measures the middle 1% of the scene. It's extremely accurate on that section and disregards the rest of the image. This method is used mainly in scenes where there is a big contrast and the most important part is in the center of the frame, for example, a backlit scene. Center-weighted metering. This metering method concentrates on the middle 70% of the shot and the outside the frame is less significant. In summary, if you'd like the whole scene metered, then choose matrix metering. If the center of the image is more important to you, then you would choose center-weighted metering. If nothing else matters in the shot, just the subject in the center, you can safely use spot metering. This is a classic scene to use spot metering. You've got a backlit scene here where you can almost hardly see the subject because the sun's so bright, and you take a few shots in matrix metering and all you end up is the silhouette because the camera's trying to take a photo for the whole scene in front of you. You can try center weighted, but it still won't do much good. So the only real way you can do this is by using your spot metering and go up close to the subject and aim your spot metering right on the center of the face, and you'll see that the camera will just meter for the face, blows the background out a little bit, but you'll get a really good picture of the subject in front of you. In certain lighting conditions, your camera can get confused and give you the wrong exposure. This is where the exposure compensation comes in handy. You can use it to increase or decrease your exposure by one full stop to achieve a properly exposed photo. Here's an example of it in action. When you've got a brightly lit scene outside and the inside has got a different exposure level, you can start to use your exposure compensation. So to do this is we take a shot through here. We see the outside's brightly lit, but we can't really make out the features of the model's face. So we start to just bring up our exposure compensation there. I've moved up half a stop here, and we start to see the features of the face starting to come out. And so we move through again, another full stop. Start to see the back blowing out, but the model's face coming brightly lit. So I'll just push it a little bit more. And you see there that we're really starting to blow it out through our exposure compensation. So we'll just move it back a little bit. There we go. All the features are coming through the model. So you can use this to bring up the level of the subject through our exposure compensation. So remember, when your subject is overexposed or underexposed, you can simply use exposure compensation for a great shot. This is a common scene with photographers and a very common problem. You have a scene in front of you that is very hard to expose for. The camera is torn between exposing for the bright sunny day outside and exposing for the darker interior. There is an explanation. We are born with this super camera in our head. It's better than any Sony, Canon or Nikon. Our eyes see about 24 stops of light, but unfortunately our cameras see only about 14 stops of light. So you have a problem. How can we increase the range of our camera to see the same scene as we do and get the right exposure? This brings us on to one of the tricks of professionals, exposure bracketing. You dial in how many stops you want to bracket and the camera under or overexposes to those levels. In this example, I've taken a few different photos to show you the range you can obtain. I chose one of the shots that looked the best and adjusted the lighting slightly in Photoshop. If I had really wanted to, I could have used a process called HDR and I could have joined 2 exposures together. Luckily my exposure was good enough to use. You can use exposure bracketing at any time and it's insurance for those times you don't get a second chance to get the right exposure. Getting the right exposure is up to you and what you want to be doing with your exposures creatively. Here I'm going to be shooting a couple of different exposures using a wide aperture and a small aperture. When you use a wide aperture and you have it completely open, your depth of field is almost razor thin. Just behind her starts to blur out. So we'll take a shot here and we start to blur out the background. But as we start to change it through, and I'll move it up to around about f4, you see the background start to come into focus. So I'll move it up a little bit more here. So we got f8, and we can start to see the trees and the scene behind the model starting to come into focus. So I'll just move through a little bit higher again. So there we are, f11, and you can start to see the trees really coming into focus here, and we'll move all the way down to f16. Now it's f16 and 1/20th of a second, so we'll probably get a bit of movement in this shot. So if you're seeing that shot, everything's in focus at f16, but at f1.4, the model's in focus, but the background's completely out of focus. Taking photos on a bright sunny day is not the ideal situation, but it's a common event for most of us. So let's look at some ways that we can combat this bright sun. I'm using today one of these. It's a 5-in-1 reflector. They range from around $30 up to $150, but after you see its uses today, you'll find they're invaluable. These are great, these reflectors. They're cheap as opposed to a flash or anything like that. There's nothing in them to break. There's no mechanical faults or anything like that. It's just a simple reflector. You don't need to color correct after you've been using a reflector as well, because you're reflecting the ambient light in the photo, where usually you need to use gels to color correct flashes. There are a couple of disadvantages as well though. Unfortunately, you're either going to need an assistant to hold the reflector, or you need one of these. This is a special clamp which holds the reflector for you. The only problem with these is when it gets a bit windy, they tend to sort of knock over unless you've got a few sandbags on them. But besides that, this is a great investment. I'm starting out here with using the diffuser part of the reflector kit to diffuse the sun. You need to get that diffuser between the sun and your subject. What you are doing is modifying the light from a small harsh light to a big diffuser light. It fills the subject with a nice even light. Next we used a gold reflector. The gold reflector added a warm feel to the model. We changed the angles of the reflector to fill in the shadows. You can vary the intensity of the fill by moving it further away from the subject. It really gives you that afternoon sunset feel. As you change to the silver, you increase your highlights and the contrast of the shot. Here we used a white reflector. The white reflector is a great way to fill in the shadows in the face, and it doesn't have that high contrast the silver reflector gives you. Sometimes changing a reflector is like an IQ test, and I have failed badly. Thank God I've got my assistants.